Hi, this is Dr. Scott, and today we're going to get into a little conversation about faith and evidence in the deletion of the IRS and the Fed. So I've been talking about this for 5 years, and by the way, in the last 6 months to almost a year, this has actually been in the works and it's in front of you. And then I hear this statement of, well, I'm not going to believe it until it happens. And I'm like, oh, come on, man. It's so patent. It's so obvious that people won't see it because they've been living on their hope. And their hope is like this crusty piece of bread that's just breaking away with that too. I mean, it's kind of so obvious. It's like this.
I'm Anita Horgarth.
Buck melanoma, Molly Russell's wart.
And so we kind of look at these circumstances and I'm like, okay, guys, I don't know how to make it more obvious for you on these circumstances. But it's been in your face in different ways. I want to walk you through a conversation though, that's actually in Scripture. But yet before I do that, I want you to understand what faith, hope, and belief actually are. Hope is something like when I walk into a season, like for instance, the Chicago White Sox walked into the 2016 season and they were hoping to win something, maybe get into the pennant race. And, because they hadn't won anything since 1906, right? Or 1909, whatever it was. And it was like, no one's expecting them to win anything because they kept on losing. And I remember my son was coming back from college and he was like, we ought to watch the series. I'm like, I really don't care about baseball that much. But he's kind of into it. I've been watching a little bit of that circumstance. And, but I didn't have any hope in that because I kind of knew some of the history of the thing. And and again, I'm not a Chicago fan, so it doesn't really matter to me, right? And yet, if I was a Chicago fan, I'd be riding on my hope and going, I'll believe it when it happens. I get that. And I get where people are in that way. That's what that's like, okay? But here's what belief and faith actually are. So Jesus is walking into Jerusalem, and right before that, he's actually been telling the people around him, the 72 around him, I'm going to die, and then I'm going to raise from the dead. And they're like, does not compute, right? Over and over again, does not compute. They don't get it. And then he says, okay, look at this temple. Or they actually say, look at the temple. And he goes, yeah, check it out. This thing is going to come down to the ground and it's going to be rebuilt. And he was talking about a prophecy in the future, but he was talking about himself. And I'm like, guys, they didn't get it either over and over again, or the disciples wouldn't have run away, including Peter, freaking out and denying him 3 times. And then after Jesus rises from the dead, the women get a sniff of Jesus alive. And they tell the men. The men run or at least some of the men run to the tomb and they see him. And they see the evidences, the clothing. Those are the evidences. That is the faith point, especially John, seeing the clothing that actually showed, that would be the Shroud of Turin, that actually showed him that Jesus actually had risen from the dead. That was the evidence point before he actually saw him. And then they're in the upper room. They could have been there for hours and more likely days with Thomas. We call him Doubting Thomas. Now, it could have, and if it was days, think about that smelly upper room. They're up there for days with the dude trying to go, come on, man. She saw him. He saw him. Come on. We have this evidence. Look. And Thomas goes, I'm not going to believe it until I touch him, which is the actual definition of belief. And that's what I've been seeing with this kind of conversation of, I'm not going to see it until I believe it kind of thing. And then Jesus walks into the room and goes, okay, touch. And Thomas says, my Lord and my God, which is the first statement actually of salvation that anyone has ever said. No one had said it before, and it would be repeated in Acts. So here's what I want you to realize there. And Jesus says, good thing, and this is the Scott version, okay. Good thing you figured it out. But there is going to be a people who will not see me, but will still believe. That's the evidence. So faith is the substance of things hoped for and the promise of things unseen. It's like walking into a court case and your lawyer says, I've got the evidence. I've got all of this substance, and have some trust in me, okay? And then he starts to lay out the case, and then he starts to take on the prosecuting attorney. And the prosecuting attorney just crumbles every single witness he puts up on the stand. That's what Trump is doing. Don't trust in me. That's what Trump is doing. And he lays out the circumstances. I've been telling you about the deletion of the Fed and the deletion of the IRS. Here is a part of the unpayable level of the loans of the Fed. They can't pay them back. The bonds are unpayable. The banks can't do them, and they're about ready to crumble. Listen to this one.
We're getting one of the worst possible signals you could ever see for the stock market. The market crashed a few weeks ago, and everyone thinks that tariffs are the big story to talk about. That is the last thing you need to be concerned with right now. The signal we are getting right now is showing the 30-year Treasury hitting a high we have not seen since back in 2007. While the media and everyone is talking about what stocks are doing and what happened a few weeks ago and are they going to recover and is the bottom in, there's a much bigger story going on right now, and we just hit a level that has not been seen in a very long time. Trump, the Fed, the Treasury, other countries, everyone is looking at bonds right now, and they are freaking out with bonds being this high. This year alone, the government...
Bonds, what bonds are, is that's what keeps the money flowing. Okay, he's talking about Treasury bonds. The banks buy the Treasury bonds that keep the money flowing and keep the Fed going. And so the Fed keeps the FDIC going, that keeps the banks going, and keeps the whole system running in this way. And President Bukele of El Salvador actually talked about this last year about the same time frame. And that's what he's talking about. Now, listen to what he says next.
It needs to refinance $9 trillion.
$9 trillion has to be refinanced. That's why Trump has been kind of screaming for them to refinance or drop the rate of the Fed. But listen to the date he says here.
Before July, the government needs to refinance over $5 trillion. The current interest rates on the debt that needs to be refinanced is only 3.24%. It went up because of the Fed hiking rates. But if they refinanced again right now without a rate cut, it would go to a point where we couldn't afford it. We already can't afford the almost $2 trillion in interest payments. Now, a 25 basis point cut is not going to do it. And the only way you could do it was by doing a major cut around 75 basis points to 100 basis points. The only
75 basis points actually isn't even enough. You actually have to drop the rate down to zero. It isn't at zero. In 2020, the rate was 0 to almost nothing. Okay. So, or nearly nothing. Okay. That's what he's actually saying, but he's not mentioning that.
Times we ever seen that happen in recent history was when COVID happened and when 2008 happened. The Fed is literally waiting for a catastrophe to happen with a major recession or major unemployment, and they need that to happen before July. If the Fed doesn't get a rate cut in, a major rate cut in, we are looking at a very, very serious global credit crisis across the entire world.
And when that occurs, global credit crisis is before July. What has Trump said to us over and over again? I've had people say, Well, I thought we were going to have a year-long celebration at Memorial Day. No, I've never heard that. What's the one thing that he has said ever since he started campaigning for the 2024 thing? That 4th of July, we would have a year-long thing. Why the 4th of July? It's because he knew that this time frame had to come up. The Fed is at its wits' end. The banking crisis is at billions, and I mean hundreds of billions of dollars, probably about $400 billion of unrealized losses that are coming up toward them. The bonds market is sitting on $5 trillion they have to refinance. $400 billion of losses, $5 trillion of unrealized losses that of bond issues that they've got to refinance so that they don't lose that $400 billion. And then this would just drop them. They would lose everything and everything would go out. You think Trump isn't thinking about that? And then we have Scott Bessent of Treasury say this.
Deliver a better product to the American people. Because Brett, I lived in New York, I lived in Florida, and state of New York spends about $235 billion a year. State of New York spends about $235 billion a year. State of Florida spends about $125 billion. Both states have approximately the same number of people, but Florida doesn't have an income tax.
Okay, so he's saying that New York has way more people than Florida, and yet Florida has the same amount of money that's coming in, and yet Florida has no income tax, but yet they have the same amount of money coming in. Meaning we don't need an income tax to keep the revenue flow in.
And I can tell you, having lived in both, it's better not to have an income tax, and Florida gives better services. So we want the U.S. to be more like Florida, less like New York.
We want the U.S. to be more like Florida than New York, which means what? No IRS. And so, guys, I just showed you two little things, two little tulips about ready to sprout here. And so I know you're asking this next question here.
Does this happen in the movie?
Now. You're looking at now, sir. Everything that happens now is happening now.
What happened to then?
We passed then.
When?
Just now. We're at now.
Go back to then.
When?
Now.
Now?
Now.
I can't.
Why?
We missed it.
When?
Just now.
Because everyone's wanting the situation, excuse me, to be over. We want it to be then already now, right? We want it to be over. And yet we're so frustrated that this thing keeps going on. I understand, because right today is June 1, and we just kind of go, when does this thing be over, right? I get it. I understand. But you know what? There is a termination event. You know what? And I'm gonna leave you with this one story. Do you know that when in the beginning of 1942, right after the Japanese invaded Pearl Harbor, most of the American servicemen, excuse me, who went into all the different branches of the Army, Navy, Air Force, and they walked in, and the Marines, excuse me, and they went in just droves. I mean, just massive droves to be able to go in, and they were sitting around, and it was near the time frame, because December 7th, right? And so they were around Christmas time, and they were around their family, and were going, hopefully it's next Christmas we'll be back together, right? Thinking that Christmas 42, the war would be over. And of course, it didn't happen in Christmas of 42. It didn't even happen when they invaded, Europe in June of 44, and they were thinking that they would be done in Christmas of 44. And it wasn't even done until September of 45, the whole thing, right? They were off on their time frames. And yet it was inevitable. It was so, if you look backward, it's inevitable. That's what we are. This is inevitable for this thing to happen. Guys, hold on. I understand you're frustrated, but do not live in your hope. Do not live in your Chicago Cubs 2016 hope level kind of thing. Live in your faith, because guess what? There is a blessing that comes when you operate in your faith. When you operate, well, I'm just going to wait for it to happen. I'm not going to believe it until it happens. Well, guess what? That's everyone in the world. Everyone in the world who operates in their belief. I can look backward and realize the Chicago Cubs were going to win, right? Because they already won in 2017. I can look backward and say, well, they already won. That doesn't take any effort or any capability to look backward in time and realize the Chicago Cubs won. But there is a point of faith, and there is a blessing that can come when you operate in your faith. I can't tell you what that is, and I don't have that date, but guess what? Operate in that faith. Can you do that? I really hope you can. Thanks so much.